Preston Hale raised his glass of champagne in my direction, the golden liquid catching the light as 9 global clients leaned forward around the private dining table. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was recognition, an acknowledgement of the deal I had spent 2 years shaping, the one that had brought these 9 powerful investors together in one room. I even allowed myself a small smile as I set my old silver pen, my grandmother's gift and my constant companion in every major negotiation, onto the table beside my notes. "To Hope Turner," Preston announced, his grin wide, his voice smooth as silk. "She's been with us a long time, a very long time." I felt my chest swell. Recognition, at last. Then the blade turned. "But today," Preston continued, pausing just long enough to sip from his glass, "we celebrate her final day with Hale Strategic Investments, effective immediately. She's been relieved of her duties." The champagne glass trembled in his hand, but it was my world that shook. Laughter, quiet and sharp, rippled from Preston as though he'd just delivered the cleverest line of the afternoon. My cheeks burned hot, but my body went cold. 9 clients, all of whom had trusted me, who had watched me fight for their compliance approvals, who had dined at my home, stared at me in frozen disbelief. One of them, Mr. Zhao from Singapore, opened his mouth as if to speak, but closed it again under the weight of the silence. His fork clattered back onto his plate. Humiliation poured over me like ice water. I am Hope Turner, Senior Compliance Director, for 17 years. I have been the reason Hale Investments could cross 12 states without a single fine, without a single regulatory block. My signature, not Preston's, not Richard Hale's, anchored every license. I lived in the fine print, the clauses that held billions together, and for this, I had sacrificed weekends, birthdays, even nights at the hospital with my ailing father. My silver pen had signed away my youth in service of this empire. And Preston Hale? He was the CEO's son, 6 months in the firm, 6 years of failing upward. His last startup collapsed in under a year. But his father shielded him, draped him in expensive suits, and handed him power he never earned. I built bridges across nations. He built castles of sand on Instagram. Now, in this room, our worlds collided. Mine forged in discipline, his in arrogance. My silence was my only shield. But in that silence, I saw the client's unease. They had come for stability and found a circus. And I, humiliated before them, understood one truth. This was not just a dismissal. It was a declaration of war. I sat there with my silver pen still resting on the linen tablecloth, Preston's mocking words still hanging in the air. And for a moment, I forced myself not to crumble. Humiliation had scorched me in front of those 9 clients. But beneath the burn, a strange current of pride steadied me. They could laugh, they could dismiss me. But I knew who I was, what I had built, and what it had cost me to keep Hale Strategic Investments standing tall for nearly 2 decades, 17 years. That's how long I had carried the title of Senior Compliance Director, though in truth, the title never captured the weight of the job. I wasn't just checking boxes or filing reports. I was the one who built the entire licensing framework across 12 states, an invisible scaffold holding up $1.5 billion in capital flows. Auditors came and went. Regulators sniffed around. Competitors whispered rumors. But Hale never once paid a fine under my watch. Not once. When the Department of Financial Services came knocking, it was my late-night work that sent them away empty-handed. When a state compliance officer threatened to pull authorization, it was my carefully worded letters, my precisely constructed clauses, that stitched the seams back together. And yet, that pride came with its shadow. My father was admitted to the hospital for heart failure 3 winters ago. I should have been at his bedside, steadying his trembling hands. Instead, I was hunched over spreadsheets and legal texts, rewriting an entire multi-state filing after regulators announced a surprise rule change. The nurses called my phone 3 times that night. I ignored them all. By the time I arrived the next morning, his chest rose and fell beneath a tangle of tubes. He smiled at me anyway, whispering, "As long as you're doing good work, I'll be proud." It cut deeper than any reprimand. My daughter, Emily, turned 21 this spring. She's bright, ambitious, and just months away from finishing her degree. But I lost count of the birthdays I missed, the parent-teacher conferences where my chair sat empty, the college visits she took with her uncle instead of me. When she called late at night to ask for advice, she often heard typing in the background. My voice stretched thin between mother and machine. I told myself it was for her, that every sacrifice was laying bricks for her future. And all of it, the sleepless nights, the missed milestones, the personal costs I could never recover, was funneled into the work Preston Hale now so casually dismissed. What Preston didn't know, what none of them seemed to understand, was that those 12 state licenses, the bedrock of Hale's operations, were tethered not to the firm, not to the CEO, but to me. Each certificate bore my signature, filed under my authority, recognized by regulatory agencies that trusted me. Not the Hale name. I had become, through years of labor and sacrifice, the living key to their empire. Remove me, and the entire structure became legally fragile. That detail was hidden in plain sight, buried in the compliance architecture I designed, and I never once flaunted it, never once wielded it for leverage, until the moment Preston forced my hand. So yes, I sat humiliated at that table, his words turning my career into a punchline before men and women who had depended on me for years. But underneath the humiliation was an iron spine made of pride, reinforced by 17 years of blood and bone I had poured into this company. My costs were high, too high, but they had not been for nothing. And in that moment, as I glanced at my silver pen gleaming under the chandelier's light, I reminded myself of one truth. The Hale dynasty did not rest on Preston's arrogance or Richard's name. It rested on the ink of my signature. And pride, even when mingled with pain, is a dangerous thing to underestimate. Contempt is a bitter taste. And that afternoon, it settled on my tongue stronger than the champagne Preston Hale still swirled in his glass. Pride in my own work could anchor me only so long before reality demanded acknowledgement of the absurdity seated across from me. Preston wasn't a leader. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't even competent. He was the heir. Nothing more. An heir whose only credential was a last name he hadn't earned. 6 months. That was the length of his tenure at Hale Strategic Investments before he was elevated to Vice President of Global Strategy. 6 months in which he attended more galas than meetings, posted more photos of yachts than policy updates, and spent more time practicing speeches in front of mirrors than learning a single thing about compliance law. I had spent 17 years immersed in statutes, decoding the arcane language of regulators until it practically beat in rhythm with my heart. Preston, by comparison, once confused a state authorization filing with a state tax return, and yet, he was the one standing at the head of the table, dictating my fate to 9 of the firm's most important clients. The rise of Preston Hale was not a story of merit, but of protection. 3 years ago, before his father installed him at Hale Investments, Preston had tried his hand at independence. He launched a flashy startup, an app that promised to redefine luxury investing by blending social media filters with portfolio tracking. It collapsed in 8 months. Leaving behind unpaid contractors and lawsuits, he quietly settled with his father's money. But at Hale, that failure was scrubbed clean, replaced with a narrative of visionary innovation. His missteps became lessons, his debts rebranded as growth opportunities. I remembered the day one of my junior analysts returned from a lunch with Preston, shaking his head and muttering words I would never forget. Preston's ideas die faster than they launch. At the time, I had smiled tightly, urging restraint, professionalism. Now, replaying those words at this table, I understood their truth more fully than ever, because here we were, seated in a private dining room meant to celebrate the closing of a deal worth hundreds of millions. And instead of stability, our clients were watching a young man play king. Preston thought firing me in public was clever theater. He thought humiliating me before the very clients I had shepherded through the labyrinth of compliance would cement his authority. He didn't understand that authority is not inherited. It is earned in late nights and signed filings and sweat-soaked mornings where the stakes are regulatory audits, not Instagram captions. I looked at him then, and contempt filled me, pure and cold. Not envy. Never envy. I did not envy his seat, his name, or his suits. I pitied the clients forced to watch this charade, and I despised the arrogance that let him believe he was untouchable. Richard Hale had built a fortress of finance, but in handing his son the keys without the discipline to wield them, he had left cracks in every wall. I had seen those cracks forming for months, Preston missing briefings, dismissing risk assessments, cutting off discussions with a flippant, "We'll figure it out." He wanted shortcuts where none existed, glamour where only rigor could stand. Now, as his laughter echoed against the walls of that room, I knew the cracks were about to split wide open. His arrogance wasn't just offensive, it was dangerous. Dangerous to the company, to the clients, and ultimately to himself. I sat straighter, my silver pen glinting faintly at the edge of my notes, and let contempt sharpen into something quieter, steadier. Preston Hale believed he had staged my downfall. He had no idea that in firing me, he had set the first stone of his own collapse. Control doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hides in silence, in the small details no one else bothers to notice. As Preston's smug voice still lingered in the air, I steadied my breathing, lowering my gaze to the silver pen resting near the edge of my notes. To everyone else at the table, it was just a pen, a trinket I carried from meeting to meeting. But to me, it was the memory of the day I drew the final line that would change everything. The day I embedded the reverse trigger clause into Hale's licensing framework. It had been a late night nearly 4 years ago, long after the offices had emptied and only the hum of the city bled through the tall windows. I remember twirling that same pen between my fingers, staring at a contract so dense even seasoned attorneys would skim past it. I had written hundreds of filings across 12 states, each one a variation on the same theme: protect the company, ensure compliance, shield against oversight. But on that night, after another argument with Richard Hale about resources, about the relentless expectation that I could do more with less, I realized something fundamental. I needed to protect myself. So, clause by clause, I rewrote the framework. Buried deep within legalese was a simple trigger: any unilateral termination of the named licensee without board approval and federal confirmation would void Hale's authorization across all 12 states. Automatic withdrawal of pending investments, immediate freeze on operations, and transfer of authority back to escrow until a new licensed officer was confirmed. And who was the named licensee? Me, Hope Turner. I remember pressing my silver pen to the final page, my hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from a calm sense of necessity. It wasn't revenge then. It wasn't even strategy. It was survival. I had given 17 years to this empire, and I needed one safeguard to ensure that if I was ever treated as disposable, the company would be forced to reckon with the cost. The most astonishing part? Richard Hale himself signed it. He was rushing that day, eager to catch a flight to London for a conference, and he trusted me, as he always had, to finalize the filings. His pen scratched the page with barely a glance, initialing every section I pointed to. He never asked why I had adjusted language, never noticed the subclause buried beneath paragraphs of boilerplate text. He wanted results, and I gave him results. And now, here we were. His son, in all his arrogance, had stood in front of 9 clients and declared my termination without board vote, without regulatory confirmation. He thought he had humiliated me. What he had really done was pull the lever of a trap his own father had signed into existence. Quietly, I traced the barrel of the pen with my thumb under the tablecloth, steadying myself. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to defend myself against Preston's arrogance or Richard's neglect. The system was already moving, invisible gears turning toward an outcome none of them had predicted. My humiliation had been public, but my control was private. Hidden in the paper trails no one else had the patience to master. One by one. Those licenses bore my name. One by one. The federal filings pointed back to my authority, and with every careless word Preston spoke, he tightened the knot. I lifted my eyes to him. Calm. Steady. He mistook it for defeat. He smirked, confident in his stage play, but inside me, there was no panic, only quiet control. The knowledge that the loudest collapses often begin with the softest signatures. The silver pen gleamed under the chandelier's light, a reminder of where my true power lived, not in titles, not in public recognition, in the ink that Richard Hale had signed, blind to the safeguard his son had just awakened. The first vibration was so faint, I thought it was just the air conditioner humming through the vents. But then I realized it was coming from the phone inside my purse, pressed against my chair. A low buzz, insistent, one that cut through the clinking of silverware and Preston's smug laughter. I slid my hand into the purse, pulled it free, and the screen lit up with a notification I knew by heart. State of Delaware, license authorization revoked, investment withdrawal in process. The words hit me harder than Preston's announcement ever could. Not because I hadn't expected them, I had written the clause myself, but because they were real now. Alive. Moving faster than even I had imagined. My humiliation had barely cooled in the air, and the system was already responding. I tried to steady my face, but across the table, one of the clients noticed my phone. Then another. A chorus of buzzes began, rippling around the polished mahogany like a hidden orchestra coming to life. Within seconds, every executive seated at that table was glancing down at glowing screens. Mr. Zhao, the Singaporean investor, frowned as his phone vibrated again and again. He scrolled, his brows tightening until he looked up sharply. "Where's the authorization code?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the room. "Why are our funds leaving your accounts?" His words landed like a stone in a pond. Suddenly, every client was awake, alive, and scrambling. One whispered in French, another cursed in Spanish, and 2 leaned across the table toward Preston with eyes blazing. Preston's smile faltered. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed unsure, almost boyish in his confusion. There must be some kind of temporary glitch, he stammered, waving a hand as though he could dismiss what was happening with a gesture. Our systems are secure, but the buzzes didn't stop. One by one, alerts stacked across the table. New York, funds withdrawn. Illinois, transfer in progress. Texas, authorization suspended. The private dining room, once filled with polite chatter, became a storm of half-whispered outrage. Glasses trembled against the wood. Untouched plates grew cold, and the illusion of Hale's invincibility collapsed in real time. I watched quietly, my silver pen still lying beside my notes, reflecting the chandelier's light. No one knew yet that this storm had been seeded by that very pen years ago. Its ink binding the clause Richard Hale had signed without thought. The shock in their faces was raw, unfiltered, an empire unraveling before the main course had even been served. One of the European clients, a tall man with a trimmed beard, snapped a photo of his phone screen. Without hesitation, He dropped it into a group chat labeled Global 9. I caught a glimpse of the name as the screen flashed in reflection off his glass. Global 9, the private consortium of international investors. A message flew out like a flare into the night. Hail licenses compromised. Withdrawals initiated. And with that, the collapse was no longer confined to this room. It was racing outward, across continents, carried on encrypted networks faster than any denial Preston could issue. Within minutes, financial circles far beyond this dining table would know that Hale's $1.5 billion was bleeding across 12 states. Uncontrolled and unstoppable. The shock hit me too, though mine was quieter, buried under practiced composure. I had always imagined this clause as a safeguard, a last resort, a line of defense I hoped I'd never see triggered. Yet here it was, alive and merciless. Watching it unfold was like standing beside a train I had set in motion years ago, knowing exactly how fast it could run, but still startled by its roar as it thundered past. Preston's face drained of color, his hand, still clutching his champagne glass, shook until drops of gold spilled onto the white tablecloth. He leaned forward, voice breaking. "This isn't possible! Someone fix this, now!" But no one moved. The clients were already too busy dialing their own teams, whispering urgent commands in half a dozen languages. The humiliation he had meant for me was gone. The shock had shifted entirely onto him. And I, silent in the corner of that storm, realized the truth. Shock is a double-edged blade. He had wanted to cut me with it. Instead, it had pierced him, and through him, the empire his father had built. Fear doesn't creep, it crashes. By the time the last phone on the table had lit up with notifications, Preston Hale was no longer the smirking heir with a champagne glass. He was a cornered boy in an expensive suit, his face pale, his voice cracking as the storm broke around him. "Call it! Now!" he barked at the assistant lingering near the door. His tone was sharp, panicked. The young woman bolted out of the room, clutching her own buzzing phone like a lifeline. But the clients weren't waiting. They leaned forward, demanding answers in rapid-fire succession. "Our funds are gone. Why weren't we notified? What kind of operation are you running here?" Preston tried to rise above it, his chair screeching against the polished floor. "Everyone calm down," he said, his hands shaking so violently the cufflinks rattled against the table. "We can stop this. Our admin controls can override the transfers. This is temporary." It was a lifeline thrown into a hurricane, and for a fleeting second, the room quieted, hope flickering in the eyes of investors who desperately wanted to believe. But I knew better, and within moments, so did they. One of the clients, a German executive with a clipped accent, snapped. "Show us. Lock it now." Preston fumbled with his phone, typing furiously, sweat dripping along his temple. He tried again, and again, stabbing at the screen. Finally, he spun the device around, his voice rising. "See? Admin override engaged. These transactions will be halted." Then the screen flashed an error message in bold red letters. Authorization failed. Admin rights expired. Silence. Not the dignified silence of business negotiations, but the heavy, suffocating kind that precedes an explosion. "What do you mean expired?" one of the clients growled. I don't know," Preston stammered, his eyes darting toward me before quickly looking away. "It must be some kind of system bug. Our admin access is... It's fine. It's always been fine." But the truth was written plainly on the screen. His declaration of my termination, made so arrogantly only minutes earlier, had been the trigger. The system recognized him as removing the named licensee, and with that removal, the authority tethered to me dissolved into a void no one else could fill. The clients erupted, phones slammed down, voices rose, overlapping in anger, confusion, disbelief. One man shouted into his Bluetooth earpiece, Another hissed at Preston in Italian, his words sharp as a knife. The carefully orchestrated luncheon had devolved into a shouting match, chaos consuming the polished room. Billions are evaporating. You lied to us! Lied! We can't afford exposure to this mess. Preston staggered back, his chair tipping and crashing to the floor. No, listen to me. This is temporary. His voice cracked, pleading now instead of commanding. He looked around desperately, searching for his father, for anyone who could save him. But Richard Hale wasn't there. No one was coming. Every passing second was a knife twist. Notifications buzzed relentlessly. California, funds withdrawn. Florida, transfers complete. The collapse wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was happening in real time, visible, undeniable. I sat quietly, my silver pen resting where it had always been, watching the empire I had built through blood and sacrifice crumble under the arrogance of a boy who thought he could humiliate me. My humiliation was fading, replaced by a grim calm. This was their fear now, their chaos. And I didn't have to lift a finger. Preston dropped to his knees beside the table, clutching his phone, eyes wide. There has to be a back door, he muttered frantically. There has to be a way to reset admin privileges. But the back door had closed the moment he said the words. Effective immediately. She's been relieved of her duties. That single declaration was enough to strip the company of my name, my authority, my protection. And without me, there was nothing left to stop the free fall. The clients rose one by one, abandoning half-eaten meals, their eyes hard, their voices cold. They were no longer partners. They were survivors, preparing to cut ties with a sinking ship. Fear had hollowed Preston's bravado, and chaos had claimed the room. And through it all, I sat in silence, steady as stone. While the collapse roared louder with each passing minute, the room was still vibrating with chaos when I decided to move. Preston knelt on the floor, clutching his phone, his voice breaking as he begged IT staff through a call that would never save him. The clients stood scattered around the dining table, their conversations jagged, overlapping in a dozen languages. Anger, disbelief, urgent calculations of how quickly they could salvage what remained. Plates sat untouched, the scent of roasted lamb turning acrid in the air. It was no longer a luncheon. It was a battlefield of egos and collapsing fortunes. And I had nothing left to prove. Slowly, deliberately, I reached for the silver pen that had been lying quietly beside my notes. Its cool weight slid into my palm, a reminder of where this all began and why I had survived as long as I had. I turned it once between my fingers, then slipped it into the inside pocket of my blazer. The small sound, the click of the pen against the fabric, cut through the noise sharper than Preston's frantic shouting. Heads turned, conversations faltered. For a moment, the entire room froze, as if every person present knew instinctively that I was no longer a participant in their chaos. I stood, not quickly, not in anger, but with the kind of stillness that draws more attention than any raised voice could. My chair scraped back softly against the polished floor. The sound measured. Final. I smoothed the sleeve of my jacket, adjusted the strap of my purse, and lifted my chin. No words, no rebuttal, no explanation, just silence. Cold dignity is its own kind of fire. It doesn't burn hot or wild. It chills. It sears in its restraint. I let that silence do what my voice could never accomplish in this room. Let it settle on Preston's shoulders heavier than shame. Let it echo in the minds of clients who had seen me hold the company together for years. Preston looked up from the floor, desperation widening his eyes. "You can't just walk away," he cried, voice cracking like glass. "You're finished. Do you hear me? Finished." I didn't answer. The clients watched me with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. They weren't looking at a defeated employee. They were looking at the one person in the room who still carried herself with composure. even as the empire crumbled around her, and they noticed. As I reached the door, my heels steady against the marble, a voice broke through the silence. Low, deliberate, meant for me and not for the others. "We'll be in touch, Ms. Turner." It was Mr. Zhao, the client from Singapore. He didn't rise, didn't wave. He just spoke, and those 6 words sank into the air like a promise. I paused only long enough to let them land in me, then continued without looking back. The handle of the heavy oak door was cool beneath my hand. I pulled it open, stepping into the quieter hallway beyond. The din of panic muffled instantly, replaced by the measured rhythm of my own footsteps. Each step away from that room wasn't defeat, it was release. Inside, Preston would keep shouting, the clients would keep demanding, and the money would keep bleeding from Hale's accounts. But outside, in the corridor washed with afternoon light, I carried something none of them could touch: my composure, my silence, my dignity intact. I didn't fight for recognition. I didn't plead for fairness. I simply walked out, my silver pen secure in my pocket, carrying with me the quiet truth that their world had already shifted, and it no longer belonged to them. The hallway outside the dining room smelled faintly of polish and silence, the kind of emptiness that follows chaos. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. By the time I reached the elevator and pressed the button, the storm inside had already begun spilling into the world beyond those oak doors. Vindication rarely arrives loudly. It comes in waves, notifications, headlines, whispers that grow into roars. By the time I stepped out of the building and into the chill of the afternoon air, my phone was already vibrating again, not with system alerts this time, but with the beginning of a media frenzy. Breaking: Hale Dynasty collapse, 1.5B, frozen across 12 states. The headline sprawled across every financial news ticker, flashing in neon urgency above streets filled with people who had no idea that a dynasty was dying just a few blocks away. I stood still for a moment, letting the words wash over me. Collapse, frozen, 12 states. The empire I had held together for 17 years was unraveling, and the world now knew it. Reporters crowded the steps within the hour, microphones jostling as they demanded answers from anyone exiting the building. I slipped away quietly, blending into the city, my silver pen warm against the inside of my jacket pocket. No one was looking at me yet. Their eyes were turned upward, toward the offices where Preston Hale still fumbled with explanations he could never provide. By evening, the coverage had gone global, screens lit up in airports, trading floors, and living rooms across continents. Anchors spoke with incredulity. A $1.5 billion withdrawal executed in real time. Licenses across 12 states revoked in one afternoon. An unprecedented failure in compliance at Hale Strategic Investments. I poured myself a cup of tea in my small apartment, exhaustion pressing into my bones. But as I watched the chaos unfold from the safety of my couch, vindication spread through me like quiet fire. Then came the article that shifted everything. Financial Times, exclusive. Internal filing shows Preston Hale lacked authority to terminate compliance director. The words stopped me cold. I clicked, my hands steady but my pulse racing. There it was, laid bare in black and white, a legal excerpt confirming that only the board, not the CEO's heir, had the power to dismiss the named licensee. Preston's theatrical declaration at lunch wasn't just arrogant, it was invalid, legally. I had never been fired. The contracts he attempted to execute afterward were already void. The article spelled it out mercilessly. Without board approval, Hale's termination of Senior Compliance Director Hope Turner carries no legal weight. As a result, the firm's compliance filings remain tethered to her authority, rendering today's events both catastrophic and self-inflicted. Vindication, pure, undeniable. For years I had been invisible, the woman in the shadows, the signature beneath every license. the ghost behind the company's spotless record. Now, my name was on every broadcast, every headline, not as a victim, not as a footnote, as the fulcrum upon which the dynasty had tipped. I thought of Preston then, his face draining of color when the admin override failed. I imagined him now, locked in his father's office, surrounded by panicked advisors, realizing that the dagger he had thrust into me had pierced his own chest instead. And Richard Hale, who had once told me, "Turner, you're replaceable," must have been staring at the same headlines, forced to confront the irony of those words. I leaned back, sipping my tea, the city lights flickering against my window. My father was still in the hospital, my daughter still waiting for tuition bills to be paid. Nothing about my personal struggles had changed, but the world now knew the truth. I was never the weak link. I was the lock. And Preston had been foolish enough to throw away the only key. Vindication, I realized, doesn't erase the cost, but it steadies the hands of those who've carried the weight, reminding them that silence is not the same as defeat. The Hale Tower was never quiet, but the night Richard Hale returned from his overseas trip, the silence in its halls felt brittle, like glass about to shatter. He swept through the marble lobby with his entourage, his coat still smelling faintly of jet fuel, his phone buzzing with news alerts he could not outrun. The Hale Dynasty collapse headline had followed him across time zones, glaring at him from airport lounges and flashing across the in-flight monitors. By the time he reached his office, rage was already simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Inside, chaos had taken root. Assistants whispered frantically in corners. Legal advisors scrolled through endless contracts, and IT staff hovered with laptops that could offer no solutions. At the center of the storm sat his son, Preston, his once pristine suit wrinkled, his face pale. He looked less like an heir than a boy caught stealing, and when he rose to greet his father, his voice cracked. "Dad, I can explain." Richard's hand slammed onto the conference table, the sound cracking like a gunshot. "Explain?" His tone was low, deliberate, but each word dripped with venom. "You humiliated this firm in front of 9 clients. You triggered a collapse that froze $1.5 billion across 12 states. And you did it by firing the one person holding our licenses together," Preston stammered. She was undermining me. I had to show strength." "Strength?" Richard spat the word as though it burned his mouth. "Strength is keeping regulators out of our offices for 17 years. Strength is securing global clients who trust us to hold their money. Strength is not theatrics in a dining room." His voice rose, then fell back into a sharp whisper. Controlled rage, not wild fury, because Richard Hale never lost control. He channeled his anger like a weapon, sharp enough to wound without bleeding himself dry. The room was silent, except for the whir of laptops. Lawyers avoided his gaze. IT staff pretended to type. Preston swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing like a trapped fish. Richard leaned closer. "Do you know what they're saying about us now? That this dynasty is finished. That my son, my successor, destroyed in one afternoon what I built over 3 decades. Preston tried again. "It's not over. We can spin this." But Richard cut him off with a look colder than steel. "You can't spin incompetence, and now the press has teeth." As if on cue, an advisor slid a tablet across the table. "Sir, you need to see this." Richard picked it up, his jaw tightening as he read. There on the screen was the headline that drove the final nail. Exclusive. Richard Hale dismissed Turner as replaceable in leaked recording. The article included a transcript of his own words, spoken weeks earlier during a private meeting. The file had been leaked. By whom? No one knew yet, and it played his arrogance back to him in cold text. "Turner is replaceable. My son is the future." The blood drained from his face, but his anger remained controlled, honed. He set the tablet down carefully, as though afraid it might explode if handled too roughly. Then he turned to Preston, his voice low, steady. You see what this means? They don't just think you're a fool, they think I'm blind. They think this firm is rotten from the top down. And they have proof, my own words. Do you understand what you've cost me? Preston's lips trembled. Dad, I didn't leak it. Of course you didn't, Richard snapped. You're too stupid to even know who might have. He took a long breath, forcing the fire back down into embers. His rage was no less powerful for being restrained. In fact, it was more dangerous this way, around the table. No one dared speak. The dynasty was crumbling not just in the markets, but in its very heart. Father and son sat in silence, one drowning in shame, the other consumed by a fury so sharp it could cut steel, yet held just tightly enough to be wielded as a weapon. And somewhere beyond those walls, the world kept repeating his words. Turner is replaceable. My son is the future. Words that now mocked him in every headline, every broadcast, every whispered conversation on the street. The morning after the headlines broke, I sat at my kitchen table with a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring at the stack of medical bills for my father and the tuition reminders for my daughter. The city outside was buzzing with news anchors replaying the collapse, reporters dissecting every misstep, and analysts labeling it the most catastrophic compliance failure in modern finance. For years, I had been invisible, the quiet figure behind the curtain. Now, the world said my name as though it had always been written in bold. Still, recognition doesn't pay hospital bills. Vindication, while sweet, doesn't send my daughter back to campus. I had protected myself legally, but I had walked out with no severance, no safety net. My pride was intact, but my future was uncertain. That's when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, long distance, international. My instinct was hesitation. After weeks of chaos, every call carried weight. I let it buzz once, twice, 3 times before answering. Ms. Turner? The voice on the other end was low, measured, carrying the clipped precision of someone used to boardrooms and negotiations. This is Daniel Mercer, Chief Executive of Strathmore Capital. The name landed with gravity. Strathmore wasn't just another firm. They were Hale's fiercest rival, a company that had been circling their contracts for years, but never quite closing. For a heartbeat. I said nothing. We've been following recent events closely, Mercer continued, his tone polite but undeniably sharp. And I'll be direct. We'd like to invite you to join us as our Chief Compliance Strategist. Your reputation speaks louder than any press release ever could. My pulse quickened. Chief Compliance Strategist. It wasn't just a promotion. It was recognition, validation. And then he added the figure. The salary he named was nearly double what Hale had ever paid me. Enough to cover my father's treatment. Enough to secure my daughter's education without fear of debt. But hope, when it comes too suddenly, carries suspicion with it. I steadied my voice. Why now? Why me? Mercer chuckled softly. Because you've proven in the harshest way possible that Hale's empire was never theirs. It was yours. The regulators trusted your name. The clients trusted your work. And when you were removed, the foundation crumbled. That tells us everything we need to know. There was a pause. And then the twist slipped in. Quiet but sharp. Truth be told, Ms. Turner, we considered signing with Hale years ago, but we didn't. Do you know why? Because our analysts told us the only reason their filings held water was because of you. And our policy is simple. We don't invest in names. We invest in people. Our trust was with you, not them. I sat frozen, the coffee cooling further in my hands. Years of being invisible, dismissed, called replaceable. Yet here was a rival admitting they had built strategy around me. Not the Hales. My throat tightened, not with humiliation this time, but with something dangerously close to relief. Mercer continued, his tone never losing that razor-edge calm. We won't pressure you for an answer tonight. Consider it. Review the terms. But know this. Opportunities like this don't wait forever. Hale's name is finished. Yours, however, is just beginning. After we ended the call, I set the phone down carefully, almost reverently. My apartment was still quiet, the bills still stacked high, but something had shifted in the air. Suspense hung heavy. Yes, the risk of stepping into another empire, another battlefield, but hope glimmered beneath it, cautious and steady, like a flame refusing to go out. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to imagine a future not defined by humiliation or collapse, but by choice. The conference room at Strathmore Capital felt different from Hale's boardrooms. The walls weren't lined with portraits of dynasties. There was no polished arrogance lingering in the air. Instead, the room was sleek, modern, alive with quiet efficiency. The long table gleamed beneath soft lights, and waiting around it were faces both familiar and unexpected. As I stepped in, my new colleagues greeted me warmly, but my eyes locked on the clients seated near the far end. Clients who had once placed their trust in Hale Investments, clients who had sat at that fateful luncheon and watched Preston Hale humiliate me. Now, they were here, waiting, their folders open, contracts ready. For a moment, suspense gripped me. Would they truly follow me? Or was this another cruel twist of fate? Another moment of false hope? Then Mr. Zhao rose, his hand extended, his expression firm. "Ms. Turner," he said, his voice steady, "we are ready to sign with you." The words sent a current through me, strong and undeniable. I walked to my seat at the head of the table, not as an afterthought, not as a silent figure, but as the one they had chosen. My silver pen lay in my hand, cool and familiar, its weight grounding me. This pen had signed the clause that triggered Hale's collapse. Now, it would write the first line of something new. The Strathmore team slid the contracts toward me. I glanced through them, my training refusing to let me sign anything without precision. Every clause, every signature line was in order. And then, with a steady breath, I pressed the pen to paper. The ink flowed smoothly, black against white, and the circle closed. Humiliation had become vindication. Vindication had become power. As I signed, I noticed movement near the doorway. A delegation from Hale had arrived. Too late. Too desperate. At their front was Preston Hale, pale and frayed, his arrogance stripped away. He carried a folder of his own, his voice cracking as he spoke. "Wait, please. Let us make a counteroffer," he said, almost pleading. "Hale Investments can still provide stability. We can recover. Just give us the chance." The clients didn't even glance at him. Their attention was fixed on me, on the papers before us, on the authority I carried in my calm silence. Preston grew more frantic. He rushed to Mr. Zhao's side, his tone no longer commanding but begging. "You know my father's reputation. You know we've weathered storms before. Don't do this. Stay with us." Mr. Zhao didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at Preston until the moment came, when my final signature touched the page. Then he turned, his words cutting with the precision of a blade. "We already chose hope." The room stilled. Preston's mouth opened as if to argue, but nothing came. His face collapsed in on itself, the last vestige of his authority dissolving in the air. He stumbled back, clutching his folder like a lifeline that had already snapped. I set my pen down gently on the table. The sound was soft, but it resonated louder than any speech. I wasn't just signing contracts. I was signing my own future, built not on someone else's name, but on my work, my sacrifices, and my unshakable integrity. The Strathmore CEO, Daniel Mercer, leaned forward with a small smile. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Turner. It seems your reputation has already secured more than we could have hoped." I nodded, but inside, I felt something greater than validation. It was empowerment, pure and steady. I had walked away from humiliation, endured collapse, and carried the weight of years of sacrifice. And now, before the very people who had once witnessed my dismissal, I had risen higher than the dynasty that tried to erase me. The silver pen lay beside me, its work not finished, but transformed. It had once been a shield. Today, it was my sword. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime, and for the first time in 17 years, I stepped into an office that was truly mine. No shadows of someone else's name hanging above the door. No legacy that treated me as expendable. Just a simple brass plate fixed to the glass wall, polished to a shine. Chief Compliance Strategist, Hope Turner. I traced the letters with my eyes, steadying my breath. Liberation wasn't loud or triumphant. It was still, calm, and undeniable. I set my bag on the desk, drew out my silver pen, and placed it carefully on the smooth wooden surface. It no longer needed to be my shield or my hidden trigger. Today, it was simply a tool, an instrument to build something fairer, cleaner, stronger. Before the paperwork or the meetings, there were 2 calls I needed to make. The first was to the hospital. My father's voice cracked when he heard the words, "Dad, it's taken care of. The bills, the treatments. You don't have to worry anymore." I could almost see the relief in his tired smile through the phone. The weight he had carried on my behalf lifting at last. The second call was to my daughter, Emily. Her laugh rang bright when I told her, "Your tuition is covered. Go finish what you started." There was a pause. Then her voice softened. "I knew you'd land on your feet. Mom, I always knew." I sat there for a moment, the quiet of the office wrapping around me, the city lights stretching far below. For years, I had sacrificed milestones, birthdays, nights of rest, all for a company that had never truly seen me, and yet, in their attempt to erase me, they had given me the greatest gift of all, freedom to define myself on my own terms. By noon, the final nail in the Hale dynasty was hammered in. News alerts flooded every screen. Breaking, Hale Investments suspended, federal license revoked for 12 months. The commentary was brutal. An empire undone by arrogance. The heir nowhere to be found. Preston had vanished from the spotlight, his name scrubbed from every article, his photos quietly pulled from press kits. Richard Hale himself had gone silent, his once proud dynasty reduced to cautionary headlines. I leaned back in my chair, my hand brushing against the silver pen. It had carried me through humiliation, through collapse, through vindication, and now, it rested not as a weapon, but as a promise. This was no longer about defense. It was about creation, building a culture where people weren't treated as replaceable, where sacrifice wasn't mocked, where integrity outlasted arrogance. Liberation is not the absence of struggle, it's the moment you reclaim your story. Justice is not vengeance, it's watching the world finally recognize the truth you carried all along. And now, I want to turn to you, the ones listening, the ones who know what it means to give everything only to be overlooked. Have you ever been treated as disposable, only to prove you were the backbone all along? Share your story in the comments. Let's make these victories louder, together. If this story moved you, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and justice. Because in a world that too often forgets loyalty, it's our voices, yours and mine, that will remind it what cannot be replaced.